Thank you for watching History Newsfeed. Please hit the like, subscribe, and notifications. We have 250 upcoming documentaries.
Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.
For many weeks and months, we lived with the horrors of the event. Every night, every single night. I had horrible dreams of being shot at. Night after night after night, these nightmares occurred. In all of our recorded history, there's nothing that made a greater impact on the nation than the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy.
One day early in October 1963, Adlai Stevenson, who was then our ambassador to the UN, called me. He had just come back from Texas. He found the atmosphere there very hostile and menacing, a lot of strong anti-Kennedy feeling. He himself was jostled in the crowd.
Adlai Stevenson was given pretty rude treatment during a visit here. This put the spotlight on Big D, and the glare lingers.
And he said he knew that the president was planning to go to Texas, and he wondered whether it was a good idea.
Basically, it was President Kennedy's idea. We had discussed it for some time. He had not been to Texas since the election in 1960, and he wanted to come, frankly, to raise some money for the Democratic Party. He had stopped briefly at El Paso many months before he actually came to Dallas. We discussed it then. He started off with the idea he wanted 5 fundraising dinners.
Gobble.
Vice President Johnson and I almost fainted at the prospect because we thought it was a great mistake.
The Democratic Party was in discord. Governor Connolly and the senior senator, Ralph Yarborough, were in venomous and unholy war with each other, and that Johnson thought this wasn't the proper time to go.
Dallas was very much a boom town, get rich quick, kind of combination of a lot of money floating around and a lot of rather primitive political views. And the Dallas press was extremely anti-Kennedy, was very reactionary, right-wing press.
He got these papers that had been put out in Dallas, these hate papers about Kennedy, how nobody loved him, and very hateful paper. And he was disturbed over those, very, very disturbed.
They thought his policies were too liberal, He'd been talking about things like the Peace Corps, the civil rights, and one thing and another, and welfare programs, and so forth and so on.
The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities.
I was visiting with him, and we planned to finally agreed on the trip. He said, perhaps I could get Jackie to come. I said, I hope you can. I really hope you can. I said that everyone would like to see her. The women in particular would like to see her. She would be enormously helpful. It would take it out of the strictly political arena, make it a personal visit. We would very much like for her to come. He said, I think I'd get her to come.
She didn't want to go, but Kennedy said, you have to go. This is a political trip, and you have to be with me to show that you're interested in my career. And so she did, but she didn't really want to go.
November 21st was spent in San Antonio and in Houston. And after the Houston event, which went swimmingly, several 100,000 people on the sidewalks, not a hostile face to be found.
We spent the night in Fort Worth, and I remember that there was a speech next morning. Jackie didn't make it down. We all chuckled about that. It was in the parking lot of the hotel where Kennedy had stayed, and I can recall him standing there saying, Mrs. Kennedy is delayed this morning, and she won't make it, and said she's fixing herself up.
Years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
Nothing must occur that is disrespectful or degrading to the President of the United States. And the law enforcement agencies in this area are going to do everything within their power to ensure that no untoward accident or incident occurs.
Somebody gave him the wrong weather report for Dallas. They had said that it was going to be chilly, and he had told Jackie that she should wear some warmer clothes. And when he found that it was going to be warm, he got very upset with the person that gave him the weather report, because he knew that she was going to be upset.
As we landed in Dallas, well, the sun came out. Looked like it was going to be an absolutely beautiful day.
Line is formed, and there is Mrs. Kennedy, the First Lady, stepping from the plane, wearing a bright pink suit with a dark fur collar and a matching pink hat, and the President wearing a dark suit steps off directly behind.
A very good crowd was there to meet the President. He worked, as we say in our politics, he worked the crowd along the fence.
And here comes the President now. In fact, he's not in his limousine. He's departed the limousine, and he is walking.
And Mrs. Kennedy was with him, and she was a popular figure at that time. And so all seemed well, and Governor and Mrs. Connolly were with him, and they then got in the limousine.
They're heading now for the official limousine, where Governor Connolly stands, waiting their arrival so that they can make their way downtown and out to the trademark.
He had heard that morning, before the breakfast, that Senator Yarborough had refused to ride the same car with Vice President Johnson the day before. So he called me over while he was waiting to go to the head table and said, John, did you know Yarborough wouldn't ride with Johnson yesterday? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, he's going to ride with him today or he's going to walk.
Were screaming, Jack, Jackie, John, and he was waving constantly. He was saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, all the way, wasn't it? And she was responding to the crowds, and, you know, it just made me feel good. I felt like everything was just doing just the way I wanted it to.
As we moved toward downtown Dallas, the crowds grew larger, cheers grew louder, and the faces grew friendlier. So I don't know how it could have been any better at that particular moment.
That day from work. That was my normal day off on a Friday. And I was going to the Knights of Columbus to cook some meat, put it in the oven, and naturally after I put it in the oven, I had a number of hours to spare until I had to take it back out. And I had my 5-year-old son with me.
It was a bright sunny day and
beautiful day.
And occasionally driving along in the parade route, Jackie would put on her dark glasses, and we could hear him almost under his breath say, take off your glasses.
When I saw that he would be passing down around the end of town, down at the school book depository area, I knew the area very well, so I felt we could get down there, park on the freeway because the freeway was not complete, and walk down and see the parade coming through.
We got down Main Street where the crowds thinned almost completely. We turned onto Houston Street where there's really no place for crowds, and they're extremely sparse. And that's when Nellie made turn to the president.
I was so pleased, and I turned to the president and I said, Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you.
Now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators.
And I picked my boy up, and we run down across the grassy area so that we could stand on Elm Street.
I suppose the president's vehicle was about 50 yards in front of us, something like that. And he came up right below the school book depository, and it turned left.
As I made the turn at the school book depository, and it had only come down a few feet, the first shot went off.
We were driving along, and I heard a noise, and I turned around to have a look back and saw the president. His hands flew up to his neck, and he collapsed and made no sound.
And I realized it was no joke that he was shot, and the strain on his face, and the car kept coming down, and just as it passed me, a few feet past me, the second shot hit.
I felt like someone hit me in the back with a balled up fist. It knocked me over, and I looked down, and I was covered with blood. And I said, my God, they're going to kill us all.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
By that time, the caravan started to speed up to get out of there, and that's when the third shot rang out. Grabbed my 5-year-old, threw him down like in like infantry style. I got on top of him to protect him and myself, and we hit the ground.
There has been shooting. Boston Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade.
Then I remember seeing that along the grassy knoll, people on the ground as if they'd been blown over. It must have been a panic, the shots. And I remember seeing one man on his hands and knees with his arm around a little boy, and he was pounding the ground like this. And you saw sights like that, so you knew something had happened.
My eyes were open. I immediately saw blood and brain tissue, chunks of brain tissue as big as the end of my little finger, all over our clothes, all over the car. And shortly after that, a second or two, Jackie said, my God, I've got his brains in my hand. And we knew that he'd suffered a fatal shot. Nellie was saying to me, be still, be still.
It's all right.
You're going to be all right.
It's all right. There were stories that I was screaming, and that there was no sound in that car. It was so bad, there was no sound.
The limousine is now traveling at a very high rate of speed. Secret Service men standing up in the limousine.
We flew down this freeway, and we were passing. We were just rushing by people, and I couldn't help but think, what an awful thing, what an awful sight for those people to see this car fly by with two women holding the shot-up bodies of their husbands.
The police have two witnesses. They are bringing them in now.
There was this rumor that some fella had been grabbed by the police down near Dealey Plaza, and the crowd thought that he was the one who had done the shooting. And the police were taking him into the jail, which was very close by there, within a half block. And the crowd was trying to get through to him.
A lot of people thought that we were the guilty party. And it got ugly out there with the people beating on the car, calling us names. I was afraid for myself, but mostly afraid for that poor 5-year-old kid that was sitting in there with me, who had no idea what was going on. He was just scared.
On the way to Parkland Hospital, in the press car, right after the shots had been fired, we knew something had happened. Merriman Smith grabbed the single phone that was in that car and started to dictate copy as we went under one underpass after another.
I was standing there at the United Press UPI ticker when Merriman Smith, the White House correspondent for UPI, got the first flash out that shots had been fired in Dealey Plaza. And right after that, the motorcade had broken off to go to the hospital. Apparently, the president was wounded.
Now, the Associated Press man in the back of the car, Jack Bell, he wanted his chance, too. But Merriman Smith wanted to make sure that he had a good, solid beat on Associated Press. Finally, he reaches forward and grabs the telephone, and with unspecified expletives, takes a swing at Merriman Smith. But Merriman Smith had more foresight than I did. He ducked and I didn't, and I got hit in the head with the phone.
I yelled out, let's get on the air. Kennedy's been shot.
Something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. I'm in behind the motorcade trying to follow them. It looks as though they're going to...
But it was a terrible moment everywhere here. Their careers hung on it. Merriman Smith ended up getting the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the assassination that day. Jack Bell just went down in history as just another reporter.
Something we had never thought of before. The old iconoscopic tube in the television camera doesn't heat up that quickly. And unless you have a machine already hot available, you can't get on the air within about 10 minutes, something of that kind. But what we did was go on the air with voice-over bulletin.
On the Friday morning, November 22nd, we met for lunch with the editors of Newsweek. And suddenly a fellow came into the room in a rather tentative way, said, I think you should know there's been a bulletin, the president has been shot. For a moment, one thought this was some terrible joke, but then it became evident it was not.
Everybody's talking about a tragedy that should never have happened. Governor Connolly was shot in the upper left chest, and the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head.
One of the first things we did was to alert the embassies, so that to kind of ask them to be sure that there was no indications in their where they were that there was anything larger afoot than just the action of a single man, because we didn't know at that time whether this was the prelude to something that would be very much bigger.
Parkland Hospital, coming to the approach. There's an officer waving me down. He's waving me around. There's a cordon. There's already a cordon of police officers running from their cars, from their vehicles here.
When we got to the hospital, the car was surrounded. I can remember hearing everybody saying to Miss Kennedy, please get out of the car. You have got to get out of the car. Get out of the car. And she wouldn't get out of the car. And they were crying because the president was dead, but she wouldn't get out of the car.
I got out of my car and I ran over, and I saw the condition of the president, whose head at that point was in Mrs. Kennedy's lap. But even then, when I saw the terrible condition President Kennedy was in, it still did not strike home to me that John Kennedy was dead.
We see first unconfirmed reports as to conditions of President Kennedy and Governor John Connolly. And just now we've received reports here at...
And I had John in my arms, and I thought, I wonder how long I have to wait out of deference to the president before I can ask somebody, please do something about John, because occasionally something would twitch, and I knew he was alive. I knew he was not dead. That's when he heaved himself up and then just collapsed. Somebody opened that door and picked him up in their arms and put him on that stretcher and took off down a corridor. I walked into the front door of the hospital, and there sat Jackie on his chair outside of where they had the body. And I went over to her, put my arms around her, but she was just like a mummy. She didn't move. She was just sitting in her chair, and I was sitting in my chair. We didn't even speak. Occasionally we would look at one another, but we said nothing to one another. I didn't care about anything but John in that room. And I'm sure she already knew that Jack was dead. And no telling what was racing through her mind. It was a terrible time for both of us.
We went to the Dallas Trade Mart where President Kennedy had been scheduled to have a luncheon. And we went into this huge hall, still not knowing what had happened. We knew something had happened, the press. And it was a tremendous hall with many tables, hundreds of people there waiting to have lunch with the president. And as I later remarked to someone, it was the first time I ever saw a rumor. You could see a rumor spreading across that huge room, these hundreds and hundreds of people.
The word was beginning to filter that something had happened, something terrible had happened. And you could see the uncertainty and the kind of panic on the faces of people, because as we came in, they grabbed us, as we went by and said, what's the problem?
A reporter named Marianne Means, who worked for the Hearst newspapers at that time, picked up a telephone and called her office in New York. And the man on the other end said, "My God," he said, "don't you know the president's been shot?" And she turned around and said, "The president's been shot." And that was the first time most of us in the press knew what had happened. We got the word back. The man in New York had heard some radio bulletin.
They took us over to the holding tank over at the county jail right across the street. It seems that the reporters followed me wanted me to come out and talk.
Tell us exactly what you saw, sir.
He was coming down the street, slumped down in the seat, and his wife reached up toward him, and as he was slumping down, and the second shot went off, and it just knocked him down from the seat. The two shots.
The offenders were shot in an assassination attempt in downtown Dallas. A priest has been ordered. Emergency supplies of blood also being rushed to the hospital.
Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital.
Dr. Berkeley met me, and he said, "I think he's gone." And you cannot imagine what a feeling I had. I thought I would never live again.
So I walked across the hall into the trauma room where they had more or less hidden Lyndon Johnson with Mrs. Johnson and his Secret Service agent. And I went up to ask him if I could go ahead and announce the death of the president. And I said, and I didn't know what to call him. So I called him Mr. President. And with that, Lady Bird sort of screamed. That was the way Lyndon Johnson found out that he was, in fact, the President of the United States. Nobody had bothered to tell him.
The first thing was obviously to get it on the air. I mean, I had to report it. I think emotionally it kind of hit me as I said the words. It caused a catch in my throat, a little hesitation there.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
had 43 days left to do in the Army. So I was out looking for civilian employment. I came out of the building, and there were these ladies standing around this taxi cab and crying. And I went over, nosy, what was going on. They were listening to the radio, and I said, what happened? And they said, President Kennedy was shot. I said, what do you mean he was shot? He's in Dallas today. We sent him off a couple of days ago. And the cab driver very stoically said, yeah, that's where they killed him, in Dallas. And I couldn't believe it. So I went to my car, and I got in it and started driving home. I lived off post because I was married and had a family. And I just cried. My eyes just welled up with tears.
I went to my office and sat there with some friends. I called Bobby, who was out at his home in Hickory Hill, in Virginia, and he told me that the president had died, and said he had just heard it from Mr. Hoover. Said Mr. Hoover had called him, and he told him with great pleasure that the president was dead. They had never gotten on well.
United States.
Johnson was running up and down the corridors saying, there's a conspiracy, there's a conspiracy. Get me out to Air Force One.
Flying for President Kennedy from the beginning of his presidency. I made the first flight with him, and I made all flights thereafter, including the one to Dallas. The first people to come up from the official party was President and Mrs. Johnson. One of the first thing he did, when he came aboard, he wanted the crew to close the window shades, that is, to block off the view from outside. And that's the first time that I had any idea that anyone thought there was a conspiracy.
Well, we hadn't excluded that possibility from the first, because this was at the height of the Cold War. And obviously the first thought on an occasion like this, well, are the Soviets behind it, directly or indirectly?
Безусловно, мы не по официальной линии, ни от Госдепартамента, ни от...
Undoubtedly, we fought not officially from State Department, but from the very atmosphere, from the press, from the television. We had the impression that they very seriously suspected the involvement of the Soviet Union in the assassination of Kennedy.
Meantime, I got hold of John McCone, who was the head of the CIA, and asked him to get busy to make sure that this didn't represent a kind of larger plot. And so he immediately convened the Watch Committee, which was a committee set up in case of emergencies, to make sure that it touch all the bases around the world and scrutinize all the intelligence.
It was known to both the KGB and to military intelligence that the armed forces of the United States had been put on higher alert. We knew that the radio, telegraphs and communications between Washington and the American command posts around the world were all on a higher state of alarm.
I had earlier in the day put some meat in the oven for a party on Saturday, and I expected that I would be back there to take care of it. So I asked to make a phone call to somebody to take care of this for me, and they wouldn't permit me to make a phone call, but they would make a phone call for me, and wanted to know to whom and what the message was. And I says, you call Mr. Smith and tell him to turn off the oven, that the meat is done. And to me, it was just absolutely self-explanatory. To them, it was a secret message.
They didn't know whether there had been some sort of a conspiracy, and whether they were still surrounded by it, or whether it was finished. Whether what was going to happen had happened and was over.
We had stuff going on like people were talking about, it's a conspiracy to overthrow the government, and we don't know what's waiting for us when we get outside. And, there may be some more gunmen outside, maybe gunmen trying to get inside. Well, they opened the door for us to bring the casket out, and the people from the state or the city, whatever, anyway, they said, you're not taking this casket out. And the federal people said, we're leaving with the thing. And there's a lot of cursing going on in this, everything. Miss Kennedy's standing behind the casket, and the priest is standing by her, and he's blessing it with holy water all this time. And there's a crucifix, metal crucifix that they have on top of the casket, Normally, these things wouldn't even slide or anything, but they was pulling this casket so violently, that this crucifix was moving around, sliding on the casket, and I was trying to hold it on there to keep it from falling off. So we would pull it a little ways, and they'd pull it back. This went on, seemed like forever, but it lasted probably 5 to 10 minutes. And then someone finally come up and said, let the SOBs go.
When I first was told that we were going to bring the casket back to Washington with us, I got my flight engineer, and we decided that we did not want to put the casket in the cargo hold down below. And we started thinking about how we were going to get it into the cabin. So we realized that we would have to move some seats. So we took out 3 rows of seats, put them in the baggage compartment, and also put the bulkhead down there to get it out of the way. And that way we had ample room for the casket.
Somebody shot him. Suspect's running west on Jefferson. Is there a connection with this other shooting? The descriptions on the suspects are similar.
I had some complaints drawn up just as a basis for arresting and holding people on a temporary basis in case that was needed. And at some point, the word came through that Officer Tippett had been killed and this fellow had been arrested.
Finally, we received information he was in the Texas Theater. About 8 officers went into the location. Officer Ennium McDonald was interrogating his third person when, as he approached him, the suspect jumped up, struck him in the face, and yelled, "This is it," and made a grab for a pistol which was inside his shirt down in his belt. The officer and the suspect both began to grapple for the pistol. The pistol trigger was pulled one time, but the gun misfired. By then, at the officer's call, the rest of us got into the situation.
When I started talking to him, he gave me his name as Lee Harvey Oswald. And so I was talking to him strictly about the shooting of the police officer. I had no idea at that time that he was going to be a suspect in the presidential shooting. I was talking to him, working on him strictly from the standpoint of shooting of the officer, which he denied. And I told him, I said, well, you seem like a fairly intelligent individual. Of course, we can take the pistol that you had on you at the time of the arrest and run ballistics on it and prove that it is the gun that shot the bullets that killed the officer. He said, yeah, I know that, but you just have to do it.
Request someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Very shortly thereafter, the connection was made between the likelihood that he, Oswald, who had killed Tippett, had also killed the president.
Did you kill the president?
No,
He wasn't belligerent to me, and he wasn't smart alecky, but he didn't admit anything either. He just, he was very straightforward with me on the questions, and of course, of denying any implication whatsoever in shooting anybody.
Reminds me of that old saying, "The king is dead, long live the king." I don't know how that happens in royalty, but when the king is dead, everybody turns long live the king, and they know who the next king is. There's got to be some kind of a moment of difficulty for the new king as well as for the family of the old king. And that was typical of what happened in the White House.
The Kennedy people were devastated by death and loss of power. And that was beginning to set in. That wasn't theirs anymore. And Johnson, though also devastated by the death of a president and a friend, nevertheless had the power that he'd relished all his life. And the Johnson people, and there was an exhilaration in that. And, you know, it was just human nature, and you had this terrible clash.
When everyone got aboard it, I thought, I started one of the engines. I thought we were ready to go. And President Johnson sent word up front right away that we weren't going yet. He was going to be sworn in on the airplane. So I shut the engine down. And then we had to wait. He sent word up that we were waiting for Judge Sarah Hughes to come swear him in, because he didn't want to be airborne and the U.S. not have a president.
People were worried. Anxiety was ruling the land. The rest of the world was wondering who this alien cowboy was who was now going to be the leader of the strongest nation on earth. And therefore, Johnson was determined, I later realized, to make the imprint early, to send the message out rapidly. So the first thing we needed to do was to find the oath of office. And so I got on the phone with a man I later discovered was the Deputy Attorney General, a man named Nicholas Katzenbach, to dispatch to us the oath of office.
I went over and got a copy of the Constitution where the oath is, and called them down, and I guess on Air Force One, it was probably a phone in the plane, and dictated the oath to them.
Somebody came to me and they said, "Come on, Johnson wants you to come up to the swearing in." I said, "Oh, no, I don't want to go. He wants you to come up there." And I thought, well, I have to go.
And at the president's request, then, Mrs. Kennedy came forward from the after portion of the ship. I was no more than a foot from her, and I watched her very closely. Her eyes were opaque, unseeing. Though she gazed out, I don't think she saw anything. She was she was sort of on the edge of being in a catatonic trance. She came forward, eyes sort of cast downward, and stood beside the president. She was wearing this pink blouse on which you could see so plainly not only blood stains all over it, but sort of grisly little white pieces of what must have been the brain of John Kennedy. It was a macabre scene. And the rest of the crowd just grouped around in an ad hoc fashion. And I'm pictured on the extreme left of the picture. I'm standing next to a very tall man, Congressman Albert Thomas of Houston. And to the lower left, holding the microphone, is the assistant press secretary to President Kennedy, Mack Kilduff.
I suddenly realized that we had no press there, no recording equipment. So I grabbed the dictaphone machine, which the president used at times to dictate letters and memoranda while he was in the air, and made sure that it had a belt on it. And if you recall the photograph of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in, you'll see a hand piping up in the middle with his microphone, a dictaphone microphone. That's my hand holding.
So the president raised his hand. Judge Hughes administered the very brief oath.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute
sat down, and everyone else sort of sat and stood. And he began to chat with some of the congressmen, and then he beckoned to me. And I came over, and I remember kneeling beside him because he was sitting down, and he put his lips next to my ear, and he said, I want you on my staff. I want you to fly back with me to Washington. And I said, yes, Mr. President. Not knowing what being on his staff meant, I had no idea. And then I asked two very stupid questions. One was, I said, well, Mr. President, I don't have any clothes. I just have a little handbag. And he said, well, call your wife and send some up, and you can buy some when you get there. Looking at me as if I'd taken leave of my senses. At a time like this, I'm worried about clothes. And then I dropped my second dumb question on him. I said, well, Mr. President, I don't have a place to live. And he said, again looking at me as if I was some cretin from outer space, he said, you can live with me. Whereupon the President said, let's get airborne.
We looked over the field, and there Air Force One was rolling down the runway. What a melancholy thing it was, that airplane. Just another of those episodes of that day that, as I say, I see it in my mind. I'll never forget it. Just something that I say we still struggle to comprehend.
So when the plane touched down on the runway, it got super quiet. You could almost hear dew dropping, so to speak. It was that kind of solemnness there. We were going to go up to it as we'd done before, and other funerals, of course, to pick the body off and put it in the ambulance as we usually do. But when we got up to the back of the airplane, the aides waved us away. So, no, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. So we stepped back.
I was standing with Jackie, about ready to get off the back end, when Bobby came running through. He had been able to get out to the plane, and he grabbed her, and they cried and cried. And then he went off with her. And I followed. And then we got in cars and went to Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Kennedy was more considerate than many presidents are to their vice presidents. Just the same, one had the sense of Johnson in 1963 as a rather shrunken figure, a spectral presence. When he came out of the plane, he was shocked like everyone else, and I think was borne down both by great sorrow over what had happened to Kennedy, whom he liked and admired, and a great sense of the weight of responsibility now falling on him.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy.
Johnson insisted that we get in with him in the helicopter so we could brief him on anything that was current and he needed to know. I got the feeling of a man almost in shock that this has occurred, that he didn't know quite what to do with it, but that he was absolutely determined. I think he saw at that time this was a possibility to put through, transform America domestically, which has been part of his larger dream from the beginning.
When we were at the hospital, Bobby says to me, would you get down to the office tomorrow morning early? The Johnson people are in there already.
It's about a 12-minute flight by helicopter, and we settled down on the south lawn of the White House. To me, it was an astonishing experience. Here I am, a citizen of this country. I'd never visited the White House. I'd never even toured its public rooms. My first visit was in the wake of an assassination and settling down on the lawn with the new 36th President of the United States.
We were up on the, I think it's the 16th or 17th floor of the Bethesda Naval Hospital, and it was sort of like a Catholic wake. We're talking about the many things that we had done with Kennedy and what he had done for everybody else and his life. And Jackie was very, she held up tremendously well. And she came to me at about 3 o'clock in the morning and she said, Mrs. Lincoln, why don't you go home and get some rest? And she said, just hold up for the next 4 days. Be strong.
Cliff Carter, who's now dead, Bill Moyers, and I came into the presidential bedroom. He got on his pajamas, got into his pajamas, and he was lying in this huge king-size bed. We were watching television. There was an endless procession of films about President Kennedy, going back to his early days, and we watched television until about 3 or 4 in the morning. As Johnson sat there, or lay there, as it were, watching, and he was talking in between watching the pictures, he began to sketch out for us, though we did not know it at the time, the outlines of the Great Society. During the evening, he said, you know, I'm gonna pass Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, which had been languishing in the Senate. And he did.
I guess daylight was about breaking at that point before, by the time we got it settled into the White House. Miss Kennedy was still with us the entire time. And we placed it in the east room of the White House on the same catafalque that had bored Lincoln's body almost 100 years earlier.
Jackie and Bobby and the other members of the family piled in behind it. Jackie still had the blood on him. And we just were sort of standing in a sort of semicircle in the corners. I mean, it was both to us a deeply personal moment, but it was also, it was their personal moment. You didn't want to intervene.
Finally, went off to sleep, and I did not sleep well because I could not wait for the morning to come, because I knew we were embarking on something that would matter greatly.
early morning of 23rd of November. I quickly got ready and went to Ostankino, to the headquarters of our television. It was impossible to work there because all the telephones were jammed solid. People were phoning not just from Moscow, but from Siberia, from the Far East, asking to be told what was happening. And people were crying. I think it was some sort of elemental reaction to the death of a young politician in contrast to the group of old guys who were heading the Soviet Union.
We have been told that the condolences book would be open at 10 o'clock, and exactly at 10 o'clock, 2 cars come to this door, Prime Minister Khrushchev and Minister Gromyko. I was with them, passed through this door to that entrance on the left. Then we went to the main hall, and main hall is on the left. On the right side, in this room, was the press, and on the left was the portrait of President Kennedy on some table, and Khrushchev took his glasses and signed the condolences book. And I saw the tears in glasses of Khrushchev and Gromyko, and they posed to the press from this corner and left the embassy after this ceremony.
I was convinced there was some sort of conspiracy. So I decided to work on the old Roman principle and ask, who will benefit from this? I answered my own question. It's Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who will benefit. So the theory which I wanted to put in my first commentary that evening on television was that perhaps Johnson had been behind it.
And at 8:30, LBJ came in and said to me, "Miss Lincoln, would you come into the office with me?" I walked in the Oval Office. He said, "I need you more than you need me." He said, could you get all of the Kennedy possessions out of the Oval Office, your office, and the cabinet room by 9 o'clock? I said, 9 o'clock? I said, I don't know. I'll let you know. I went to Bobby, and Bobby just could not understand it.
Johnson, I think, probably had his reasons for doing it, but it did cause a certain amount of resentment. I mean, the haste seemed unseemly. I gathered a group of people together, Kennedy loyalists, so to speak, and we had lunch in the upstairs room of the Occidental restaurant. And I think there is a general feeling that whereas Johnson on certain issues, domestic policy would be fine, that on foreign policy he might diverge from Kennedy in some regard.
At the lunch, there was this discussion about whether or not there were alternatives to Johnson, or we were far from the convention at that point. Bobby's name lurked in the background. He wasn't there, but he was the obvious choice. Johnson was moving very fast, so there was no chance, and Bobby knew that.
There was a rumor came late in the afternoon that day that the district attorney's office was going to charge Oswald with murder, which made sense, but that it was going to be a charge of murder as part of an international communist conspiracy. And I can't really recall now where that came from, whether it was a radio, whether an agent told me that. I just don't remember, but I know I was very disturbed about it.
He struck me as awfully calm under the circumstances. He answered the questions without any hesitation as far as I was concerned, and gave answers that I probably, had I just shot two people, I'll put it that way, I don't think that I would have been as calm as he is or was at that time. I know that Captain Fritz asked him one time if he was a communist, and he said no, that he was a Marxist, but there was a difference between the two of them.
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers. But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist. Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
I had the State Department check the passport that Oswald had used once we identified Oswald. We discovered that he had spent some weeks in the Soviet Union. And this, in the atmosphere of the time, aroused our concern, because we wanted to know what he was doing there.
That very evening, when Lee Harvey Oswald's name came out, and it was discovered that he had been in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev gave an instruction to the chief of KGB to collect together all the material we had on this man. He wanted to know who this character was.
Obviously, our embassy in Moscow made some inquiries as well as checking the intelligence, and came back with the words that the Soviets were as upset about this as we were.
Разделяют горе вместе с американским народом по этому случаю. All Soviet people are deeply grieved over the tragic death of John Kennedy and share in the grief of all Americans at this tragic loss.
When I got home, the first thing my mother said was, "We're going to Washington." She said, "Pack." And I said, "I can't pack." And she said, "Why?" I said, "I have a date." And I said, "What do I do?" And she said, "Tell them you're not going." When we were on the way in the car, Dad was very serious at one point, and he said to us, "I really want you to realize that this is the making of history." And he said, "I want you to understand that history is just not part of the past. It's part of the present." And he said, "We will see much that will make us think of everything in the past." But he said, "You must be part of what is about to happen." It didn't make a great deal of sense to us or to anyone else at that point. This was not what we considered a violent nation. We weren't used to violence. We would talk to the different people, and they would say, "I've been here all night." Some people had their sleeping bags with them. There were some families that came down from Canada. There was one particular family, they slept in a car all night. And you asked them why, and they said, we had to be here. We couldn't tell you why. It was that important that we come.
assignment was to get an eternal flame. Probably Jackie wanted an eternal flame. I immediately called the Pentagon. They get the most of everything. And I asked them, talk to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or one of, maybe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he said, well, we don't have an eternal flame. And I said, you mean you sons of bitches can blow up the entire world by pressing a button, and you can't get an eternal flame for a grave site? And he said, well, we'll try to get one. I think there's one in France. I said, well, if there's one in France, go get it. It takes only 4.5 hours to get over there and back. The funeral is in for a couple of days. And hung up on him. And I think reminded me, I did get a call back from, not from the general, from an assistant saying, what is eternal? And I said, eternal, goddamn it, is forever.
Jackie was extraordinarily sensitive to the, I guess, to the fact that President Kennedy himself would have wanted whatever was done to be unvarnished, undramatic, essential, clear, simple. And she had the sensitivity and the brains and the capacity, experience, etc., to do that.
There we were, in the rotunda. Well, you know, my eyes fell out of my head and went, oh my God, where are we?
It was so dark, and it looked so huge, and everywhere you looked were people. And then your eye immediately went to the casket and the flag draped, and that became, to me, the real moment of realism, that somehow this was no longer just words on a radio or the words from your family. It was true. It was here, and it was overpowering.
U.S. attorney in Dallas, Barefoot Sanders, and told him my concerns and asked him to be sure that Oswald was being treated properly, and particularly be careful about where they put him in jail, because I thought that other inmates might attack him and beat him, possibly even kill him.
It seems like the media just fell out of the sky. When I turned around, that hallway up there was filled with them. On one occasion, I felt something behind my legs, and I looked down. There was a cameraman on his knees, and he had his camera stuck between my legs, shooting upwards towards Oswald and taking his picture. So I immediately gave him a little shove with my foot backwards down the hallway and proceeded on to the elevator. Captain Fritz told me to handcuff him to his right arm to my left arm, and also put handcuffs between his two hands. So I had two sets of cuffs on him. And as I started, just prior to going down, I said to him more in jest than anything else, I said, Lee, if anybody shoots at you, I hope they're as good a shot as you are. Meaning, of course, that they'd hit him and not me. And he kind of laughed. It's the only time I heard him laugh during any time that he was in custody. And he said, oh, you're just being melodramatic. He said, ain't nobody going to shoot at me.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
I just said, oh, shit.
Oswald has been shot. There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot.
I mean, my first thought, my God, the country is falling apart. I mean, first the president is shot, and then the fellow who shot the president is shot. So this can't go on.
Pandemonium has broken loose here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters.
No, I saw a man there. I thought he was one of the detectives. Well, he was a stocky guy, well-dressed, with a hat he had on.
Where did he go?
I knew Jack Ruby, and I'd done business with him and police work, but he and I never socialized together. Now, some of the officers did, I understand, go down there, and I'm sure some of them did. Not near as many as news media and other people to have you believe, but there were a few that did go down because I'm sure he gave them free beer and so forth, and he liked to be around police officers. But at the time he stepped up there and done the shooting, I knew it was somebody that I should know, but I couldn't think of his name to save my soul.
Did you ever speak to Lee Oswald in your life? Never have. I never used the term angry. That's not in my vocabulary. And any enterprise I went into was specifically legitimate. Jack, not only asked you if you ever spoke to him, not only did I ever speak to him, did you ever see him or know of him? Never saw him and know him in my life.
Well, Ruby was one of those guys who was at every boxing match, every fire, every big catastrophe. He made it a point to get to know people who were on television, as I was at that time, or to know the people in the press in general.
Tell us how you felt about the whole thing.
He's certainly right now if you look at him.
He was emotional, he was high-strung, he would even talk in a very high monotone voice sometimes. And frankly, he was one of those guys who, when you were out on a story as a newsman and he'd come up to talk to you, you were kind of impatient with him. You wanted to, get lost. I've got to do my story here.
First thing I heard was Oswald has been shot, and they're bringing him into Parkland Hospital, which is where we were. And, of course, that made me sad. It upset me because I thought, why are they bringing him here where John is struggling so hard to recover from the wounds that he gave him?
As I arrived in the emergency room, they were rolling Oswald in through the emergency room doors on the stretcher. And they started to the hallway where we have the emergency surgery area. And they started to the right, which would have been the room where the president, and all of a sudden everything just stopped. And they went to the other side.
And the bullet had gone almost through him. I had found it when I examined him after the shooting, and it had just lodged under the skin. I could turn it around under the skin over on his right side. Had the bullet gone all the way through him, it would have hit me in roughly the same place that it hit him. So as I got him in the trauma room, I told the doctor, I said, before you do anything else, I want that bullet out of there. So he just reached over and pulled the skin tight and hit it with a scalpel, and it just popped out on a tray like a ripe grape seed.
Of who did it, that wasn't the big thing then. It was why was this ever done? Why did it have to happen to a family like this? This was a good man. We needed him. The country needed him. The world needed him. Why was this ever done to him?
was killed, something extraordinary happened around the world. His death, I guess, was one of the first, maybe the first death of a heroic figure upon whom not just Americans, but maybe 1 billion people around the world pin their hopes.
Captured the imagination of young people who hadn't taken any interest in politics up to then. And it was, that perhaps was the greatest importance in his untimely demise, was that it killed a lot of the enthusiasm for government and politics that he had inspired young people to have.
Time that he almost felt like the end of the world was coming, it seemed. Because Kennedy had been such, in our estimation, a great president. He revitalized all of us, energized us, made us become more involved in the politics of this country. So we were ending 1963 on a very bad note with his death. It just seemed like it was useless. It was all over.
The White House press gathered in a body. There weren't that many of us, maybe 20 or 25. And we walked on foot behind the caisson. And it was a kind of a mark of respect. We'd all decided to do that. We had followed the president on many trips, including trips to Europe. And we felt that it was fitting that we should follow him on his final trip.
And the sense one had of the vanity of life and the mortality of humanity.
Vividly, for example, riding across the bridge to the burial place where Kennedy was buried, and you see the people 6 and 7 deep standing there as the automobile went by, and they would look at you and you would look at them, and there was the same look on their face which I know was on my own face, and that is a look of incredulity, of being incapable of explaining what had happened or understanding what had happened.
Kennedy was a hero to all of us. And even though this business of burying people make you cold and callous, and it becomes just a job after a while, with him it was different. It didn't hit me until later what I had done, who I had buried, because that day it was all military. But some people, it affected them a little bit differently. So the bugler, he hit some bad notes because he was crying over there on the hillside. It was a very emotional time.
It truly was finished. There wasn't anything else that you could do at that point. That's so long time ago, but I have that feeling now that it was so special that you can't probably put it into words, but it was a fine moment for our family.
I've often wondered, here's a young American president that gets assassinated. I get hit, but I live. Why did I live? Why was I spared? It changed my life and my thinking in the sense that it made me impatient of trivia, of selfishness, of unimportant things, of minutiae, whatever talent you have, whatever ability you have, you ought to use to the maximum extent possible, because you never know how long you have.
Thank you for watching History Newsfeed. Please hit the like, subscribe, and notifications. We have 250 upcoming documentaries.